The rattling stagecoach wheels hit a rut in the road, jolting Sarah Wilson awake as dust filtered through the cracked window. It was 1878, and the unforgiving Colorado Territory stretched before her like an uncertain promise. 3 days of travel had left her bonnet askew and her spirits lower than the valley floor they traversed. But nestled against her side, wrapped in a threadbare blanket despite the summer heat, 6-year-old Matthew slept soundly, unaware of the whispers and stares that had followed them from St. Louis. Sarah gently brushed a lock of hair from Matthew's forehead, careful not to disturb him. His peaceful face, so innocent in sleep, bore no sign of the condition that set him apart. When awake, his eyes wouldn't focus properly, and his limbs moved with an awkward, jerky rhythm that other children had cruelly mimicked back home. The doctors had called it a birth defect with clinical detachment, but to Sarah he was simply her beautiful boy, as perfect as the day he'd come into this world. "Not much farther to Silver Creek, madam," the driver called back, his voice carrying over the constant rumble. "Be there before sundown." Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see her. Silver Creek, a frontier town she knew only from her late brother's letters. James had written of opportunity, of silver mines and cattle ranches, of a place where a person could remake themselves. After her husband Thomas had abandoned them 3 years ago, unable to bear the responsibility of raising a simple child, as he called Matthew, Sarah had tucked away every penny from her seamstress work. Now those savings had bought them passage west, where nobody knew their story. The stagecoach lurched to a stop at a small way station, the last before their destination. Sarah gathered Matthew in her arms, his body warm and slight against her chest as she stepped down into the dusty yard. 20 minutes, the driver announced. "Get yourselves some water and whatever else you need." Matthew stirred and opened his eyes, blinking rapidly in the harsh sunlight. His arms flailed slightly as he adjusted to being awake, a motion that always drew attention. "Water, Mama?" he asked, his words slurred but understandable to her practiced ear. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's get some water." Inside the cramped station, a handful of travelers stood around a scarred wooden counter. A man with trail-worn clothes turned as they entered, his eyes immediately drawn to Matthew's unsteady gait. Sarah felt her spine stiffen as she recognized the familiar look of curiosity followed by discomfort. "Excuse me," she murmured, guiding Matthew toward the water barrel. "What's wrong with your boy?" the man asked bluntly, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room fell silent. Matthew sensed the attention and pressed closer to Sarah's skirts, his breathing quickening as it always did when he became anxious. "Please don't mock my son," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she reached for a dipper. "Madam, I wasn't," the man began, but was cut off by a deep voice from the doorway. "I believe the lady asked for some courtesy." The voice belonged to a tall figure silhouetted against the bright doorway. As he stepped inside, Sarah saw a man perhaps 30 years of age, with broad shoulders and a weathered face partially hidden beneath a well-used Stetson. His clothes were trail-dusty but of good quality, and the gun at his hip appeared to be worn from use rather than for show. The other man mumbled an apology and moved away. The newcomer approached them slowly, as if conscious not to startle. He crouched down to Matthew's eye level. "Howdy, young man. My name's Daniel Colton. Folks call me Dan." He offered his hand to Matthew, who stared at it with fascination. Matthew reached out with his unsteady hand and grabbed Dan's fingers. "I'm Matthew," he replied, the words coming out thick but clear enough. "Matthew," Dan repeated with a smile. "Strong name for a strong boy. You helping your ma on this journey?" Matthew nodded enthusiastically, his whole body rocking with the motion. "I carry the small bag." "Well now, that's mighty responsible." Dan looked up at Sarah, his hazel eyes showing neither pity nor discomfort, just simple human warmth. You folks headed to Silver Creek on this coach? Sarah nodded, still wary. Yes, my brother had a claim there. Had? Dan asked, rising to his full height. He passed last winter. Influenza. Dan removed his hat in a gesture of respect. Sorry to hear that, madam. James Wilson, was it? Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face because Dan quickly explained, small town. Word gets around when someone passes, especially someone who had a promising silver claim. The stagecoach driver called for passengers to board. Dan reached down and, with a questioning glance at Sarah that she answered with a hesitant nod, lifted Matthew into his arms. Let me help you both aboard, he said, carrying Matthew as if he weighed nothing at all. To Sarah's astonishment, Matthew didn't stiffen or cry out as he usually did with strangers. Instead, he seemed fascinated by Dan's hat, which the man had placed back on his head. You a real cowboy? Matthew asked as Dan set him gently on the coach seat. Sure am, partner. I run cattle about 5 miles outside of Silver Creek. Do you have horses? Dan laughed, a rich sound that filled the small coach. Can't be much of a cowboy without horses. Got about a dozen of them. Matthew's eyes widened with delight, and he turned to Sarah. Mama, horses. Dan met Sarah's gaze, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that here was a man who saw her son first and his condition second. We won't keep you, Mr. Colton, Sarah said, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after days of travel. Actually, I'm headed back to Silver Creek myself. Mind if I join you for the last stretch? Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a small spark of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. As the stagecoach rumbled towards Silver Creek, Dan kept Matthew entertained with stories of frontier life, of cattle drives and Mustang herds, of nights spent under stars so bright they cast shadows. He had a talent for storytelling, painting pictures with words that captured even Sarah's imagination. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a proper town with wooden sidewalks and a handful of 2-story buildings among the more common single-story structures. Main Street, Dan explained as the coach slowed. You've got your general store, a Sayer's office, 2 saloons, though I'd recommend staying clear of the Rusty Nail, a hotel, and the sheriff's office. Where will you be staying, Mrs. Wilson? It's Miss, Sarah corrected automatically. My brother's cabin, I hope. He wrote that it was just outside town. A shadow crossed Dan's face. Miss Wilson, I'm afraid there might be some confusion. Your brother's claim was about 3 miles north, but the cabin itself. He hesitated. There was a fire about a month after he passed. Not much left, I'm afraid. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd counted on having somewhere to stay, somewhere to start their new life. I see, she managed, her mind racing. Their funds wouldn't stretch to more than a few nights at a hotel. Dan seemed to read her thoughts. The Wilcox Hotel is decent enough, but expensive for a long stay. I'd be happy to show you to your brother's land tomorrow, if you'd like. Perhaps some of it can be salvaged. The coach pulled to a stop in front of the hotel. Dan jumped down and helped Matthew first, then offered his hand to Sarah. His palm was calloused but warm, and he held her hand a moment longer than necessary once she was safely on the ground. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Colton, Sarah said, withdrawing her hand. Dan, he corrected with a smile. And it's no trouble at all. I'll come by tomorrow morning, if that suits you. Sarah nodded, gathering her small bag in one hand and Matthew's hand in the other. As they walked toward the hotel entrance, she heard Matthew call back, Bye, Mr. Dan. Dan tipped his hat and called back, See you tomorrow, partner. That night, in their small hotel room, Matthew couldn't stop talking about the cowboy. He likes me, Mama, he said as Sarah helped him wash his face. Of course he does, sweetheart. You're a very likable boy. Not everyone thinks so, Matthew said with the simple honesty of childhood. Some people look at me funny. Sarah's heart clenched. Those people don't take the time to know you. Mr. Colton did. Can we see his horses tomorrow? We'll see, Sarah replied, tucking him into bed. First, we need to see about where we're going to live. Morning came with the sound of wagons and the bustle of a town coming to life. Sarah dressed Matthew in his best shirt, one of only two he owned, and tried to make herself presentable with limited resources. A knock came at their door precisely at 8 o'clock. Dan stood in the hallway, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and trousers. His hair, dark brown with hints of copper where the sun had lightened it, was still damp from washing. "Morning, Miss Wilson, Matthew," he greeted them. "I've arranged for a wagon to take us out to your brother's claim." The journey took less than an hour. As they approached, Sarah could see the charred remains of what must have been a small cabin. Her heart sank further. The fire started in the stovepipe, from what folks could tell, Dan explained as he helped them down from the wagon. Spread quick. By the time anyone noticed from town, it was too late. Matthew ran ahead, fascinated by the open space and the distant mountains. Sarah watched him carefully as Dan walked her through what remained of her brother's property. "The claim itself is still valid," Dan said. "The assayer's office confirmed it. Your brother struck a decent vein about a week before he fell ill. Not enough to make him rich, but steady income if worked properly." "I know nothing about mining," Sarah admitted. Dan nodded. "Most folks hire out the actual mining work, but without a place to live." Sarah squared her shoulders. "We'll manage. Perhaps I can find work in town as a seamstress again. Save enough to build something small." Dan looked at her thoughtfully. "Building takes time and money. Winter comes early in these mountains." The reality of their situation was becoming clearer by the minute. Sarah had gambled everything on this move, and now she faced the very real possibility of failure before they'd even properly begun. "Mama, look," Matthew called, pointing excitedly at a small creek running along the edge of the property. "Fish." Dan smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "That's Wolf Creek. Good fishing if you're patient." He turned back to Sarah, his expression becoming serious. "Miss Wilson, Sarah, if I may, I have a proposition for you." Sarah tensed slightly, wary of propositions from men she barely knew, no matter how kind they seemed. Dan continued, "My ranch house is larger than I need. It was built by the previous owner who had a family. There's a separate small cabin about 100 yards from the main house originally for a ranch hand, but it stood empty since I bought the place. It's yours if you want it, for as long as you need." Sarah stared at him, speechless. "No strings attached," Dan added quickly. "But I could use help around the place. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, comes in 3 times a week, but she's getting on in years. If you're handy with a needle, there's always mending to be done, and the ranch hands would pay for proper meals." "Why would you do this for strangers?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Dan looked over at Matthew, who was now crouched by the creek, watching the water with intense concentration. "Maybe I just appreciate good company," he said simply. "The ranch gets lonely." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of ulterior motives, but found only honest openness. "I'll need to see this cabin first," she said finally. Dan's face broke into a wide smile. "Of course. We can go right now if you'd like." The Colton Ranch sprawled across a valley backed by pine-covered hills. The main house was solid and well-built, with a wide porch and glass windows, luxuries on the frontier. The cabin Dan had mentioned sat on a small rise, close enough to be convenient but far enough for privacy. Inside, Sarah found a simple but sound structure: one main room with a small bedroom off to the side, a functional stove, and even a small table with 2 chairs. It was dusty from disuse but otherwise clean and well-maintained. "It's not much," Dan said, watching her survey the space. "It's perfect," Sarah replied honestly. After weeks of uncertainty, the little cabin felt like a miracle. Matthew had already claimed the small bedroom, bouncing experimentally on the bed frame that awaited a mattress. "We'll bring over a proper mattress from the main house," Dan assured her. "And whatever else you need to be comfortable." "I can't accept charity," Sarah said firmly. "Not charity," Dan countered. "An arrangement. You help with the cooking and mending, I provide lodging. Fair exchange." Sarah considered this. It was a generous offer, probably more generous than Dan was acknowledging, but it would allow her to keep her pride intact. "Agreed," she said at last, extending her hand to shake on it. Dan's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "Welcome to the Colton Ranch, Miss Wilson." The first weeks at the ranch passed in a blur of activity. Sarah threw herself into making the cabin a home, using her skills with needle and thread to create curtains from spare fabric Dan provided. She took over much of the cooking for the ranch hands, 5 men who worked the cattle and kept the operation running. They were good men, Sarah discovered, who took their cues from Dan and treated Matthew with kindness and patience. Matthew thrived in the open spaces of the ranch. Dan kept his promise about the horses, teaching the boy how to brush them and even letting him sit in the saddle while Dan led the gentlest mare around the corral. For a child whose movements were often uncoordinated, Matthew showed remarkable determination when it came to the horses, focusing with an intensity Sarah had rarely seen in him. "He's got a gift," Dan told her one evening as they watched Matthew feed an apple to his favorite horse, a dappled gray named Shadow. "A natural way with animals. He's never had the chance to be around them before," Sarah said. "In St. Louis, we lived in a small apartment. There were only street horses and working mules." Dan nodded thoughtfully. "Animals don't judge. They respond to kindness and confidence. Matthew has both in spades." As summer turned to early fall, Sarah found herself watching Dan when he didn't notice. The way he patiently explained things to Matthew, never showing frustration when the boy needed extra time to understand. The way he treated his men with respect and fairness. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which he did often around Matthew. And, she had to admit to herself, the way he looked on those hot afternoons when he'd returned from working with the cattle. His shirt clinging to broad shoulders, hat pushed back on his head. She wasn't the only one watching. More than once, she'd caught Dan's gaze lingering on her as she hung laundry or kneaded bread dough. There was something in those looks that made her breath catch. But he never pushed, never presumed. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains in mid-October. Sarah watched it from the cabin window, Matthew pressed against her side. "It's so pretty, Mama," he breathed, his breath fogging the glass. A knock at the door announced Dan, stomping snow from his boots. "Thought you might want these," he said, holding out a package wrapped in brown paper. "Winters get cold here." Inside the package, Sarah found 2 hand-knitted scarves and a pair of sturdy gloves sized for Matthew. "Mrs. Abernathy made them," Dan explained. "She's been wanting to since you arrived, but wanted to surprise you." Sarah ran her fingers over the soft wool. "Please thank her for us." Matthew immediately wrapped the red scarf around his neck, the ends trailing nearly to his knees. "Can I show Shadow?" he asked eagerly. "It's too cold for you to go to the stables right now," Sarah began, but Dan interrupted. "I'm headed there myself. How about I take him with me? We won't stay long." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Matthew's face lit up as Dan helped him into his coat and bundled the scarf more securely around him. Alone in the cabin, Sarah moved to the window, watching as Dan lifted Matthew onto his shoulders, the boys' delighted laughter visible even through the glass. Something warm unfurled in her chest, something she'd kept carefully guarded since Thomas had walked out that door 3 years ago. Dan returned with Matthew an hour later, both of them red-cheeked from the cold but smiling widely. "Shadow liked my scarf," Matthew announced proudly as Sarah helped him out of his wet things. "Did he now?" Sarah smiled, hanging the damp scarf near the stove to dry. "Dan says I can learn to ride by myself when spring comes," Matthew continued excitedly. "He says I'm getting strong enough." Sarah glanced at Dan, who stood awkwardly by the door. "If that's all right with you, of course," he added quickly. "We'll see," Sarah said, not wanting to dampen Matthew's enthusiasm but concerned about his safety. After Matthew had been settled with a book, he struggled with reading but loved looking at the pictures. Dan lingered at the door. "I actually came by for another reason," he said, his voice lower so Matthew wouldn't hear. "There's a social at the church in town Saturday night. Dancing, food, that sort of thing. I thought, that is, if you'd like to go." He trailed off, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Sarah realized with a start that this confident man, who commanded respect from rough ranch hands and faced down the dangers of frontier life daily, was nervous about asking her to a dance. "Matthew," she began. "Would be welcome too, of course," Dan said quickly. "The whole town will be there, families and all." Sarah considered. They'd been to town a few times since arriving, and while there had been curious looks, people had generally been polite. "I'd like that," she said finally. "We both would." Dan's smile was worth any potential discomfort the social might bring. Saturday arrived clear and cold. Sarah spent extra time on her appearance, wearing her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. Matthew, sensing the importance of the occasion, sat unusually still as she combed his hair and fastened his one good shirt. Dan arrived with the wagon, dressed in what Sarah recognized as his Sunday best, a clean black coat over a white shirt, his usual worn boots replaced by polished ones. He helped them both up to the seat with careful courtesy, but Sarah didn't miss the appreciative glance he gave her as she settled her skirts. The church hall was warm and bright with lanterns, filled with the sound of fiddle music and conversation. Sarah felt eyes turn their way as they entered, Dan's hand resting lightly at the small of her back. "Daniel Colton, as I live and breathe," called a woman's voice. "Finally decided to join the living again. Have you?" A plump, friendly-faced woman approached, her gaze curious but kind as it took in Sarah and Matthew. "Mrs. Jenkins." Dan greeted her with a tip of his hat. "May I introduce Miss Sarah Wilson and her son Matthew? They're new to Silver Creek." "Sarah, Matthew, this is Mrs. Jenkins, our postmistress and the purveyor of all town gossip, authorized or not." Mrs. Jenkins swatted his arm good-naturedly. "Somebody has to keep things interesting around here. Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Wilson. And young Master Matthew, there are some other children over by the refreshment table, if you'd like to join them." Matthew pressed closer to Sarah's side, suddenly shy. Dan crouched down to his level. "What do you say we get some punch first?" he suggested. "I hear Mrs. Turner makes the best berry punch in the territory." Matthew nodded, taking Dan's offered hand without hesitation. Mrs. Jenkins watched them go, then turned to Sarah with undisguised interest. "So you're the mystery woman who's been living out at the Colton Ranch. There's been talk." Sarah felt her defenses rise. "I'm sure there has been." Mrs. Jenkins waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing like that, just curiosity. Dan's kept to himself since he came here 4 years ago. Polite enough, does business in town but never socializes much. Then suddenly he's bringing a woman and child to the social." She smiled. "It's a good thing if you ask me. Man shouldn't be alone." Before Sarah could respond, Dan returned with Matthew, who clutched a cup of punch with both hands, concentrating hard on not spilling it. "Would you care to dance, Sarah?" Dan asked, nodding toward the space cleared in the center of the room where several couples were already moving to the fiddle's tune. "I'm not sure." Sarah glanced at Matthew. "I'll keep an eye on the young man, Mrs. Jenkins offered. "My grandson Peter is about his age. They can get acquainted." Matthew looked uncertain but gave Sarah a brave nod. "I'll be good, Mama." The dance was a simple one, thankfully, as Sarah hadn't danced in years. Dan's hand was warm at her waist, his other holding hers as they moved among the other couples. He was surprisingly graceful for a man who spent his days on horseback. "You're a fine dancer, Miss Wilson," he said, his voice pitched just for her to hear. "Sarah," she corrected, feeling bold. "If we're dancing, I think you can call me Sarah." His smile deepened. "Sarah," he repeated, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue. They danced 2 more dances before Sarah insisted on checking on Matthew. She found him sitting with a boy she assumed was Peter Jenkins, along with 2 other children. To her surprise, Matthew was talking animatedly, showing them something in his hands, a small wooden horse, she realized, one that Dan had carved for him the previous week. "See," Matthew was saying. "His name is Shadow, like the real Shadow at our ranch." One of the children, a girl with pigtails, looked up as Sarah approached. "Your boy knows a lot about horses, madam." "Our ranch," Sarah thought, the words echoing in her mind. When had the Colton ranch become ours in Matthew's mind? The evening continued pleasantly. A few people stared when Matthew's movements became more pronounced as he tired, but most were welcoming. Dan seemed to know everyone, introducing Sarah and Matthew with a pride that suggested they were already family rather than tenants. As they drove home under a canopy of stars, Matthew fell asleep between them, his head eventually coming to rest against Dan's arm. Dan glanced down at the sleeping boy, then at Sarah, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "He's a remarkable child," he said softly. "Yes, he is," Sarah agreed, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for seeing that." Dan was silent for a moment, then said, "I had a brother, younger than me by 6 years. He was different too, couldn't speak properly, had trouble with his balance. Our father couldn't bear the shame of it, kept him hidden away. I used to sneak him out to the creek to fish, teach him things when our father wasn't looking." Sarah listened, sensing this was something Dan rarely spoke about. "He died when he was 12. Fever. I was away at the time working a cattle drive. Never got to say goodbye." Dan's voice was steady but held an old pain. "When I saw you and Matthew at that way station, how that man was looking at him, it brought it all back." "I'm sorry about your brother," Sarah said gently. Dan nodded. "Been a long time now, but I promised myself, if I ever had the chance to make a difference for someone like him, I would." He looked down at Matthew again. "Turns out it's not just about making a difference. That boy of yours has brought more life to my ranch in 3 months than I managed in 4 years." They reached the ranch, and Dan carefully lifted the still sleeping Matthew into his arms. Sarah opened the cabin door, and Dan carried him to his bed, laying him down with a gentleness that made Sarah's heart ache. At the door, Dan hesitated. "I had a fine time tonight, Sarah." "So did I," she admitted. "I'd like to call on you properly, if you'll allow it." Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, the earnest eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the kindness that radiated from him. "I'd like that very much, Dan." His smile was slow and warming. "Good night, then," he said, and on impulse, bent to press a chaste kiss to her cheek before stepping back into the night. Sarah touched her fingers to the spot, watching him walk back to the main house, and for the first time in years felt the flutter of genuine happiness. Winter settled over the valley, bringing with it short days and long, cold nights. Dan began taking his evening meals at the cabin more often than not, helping Matthew with his reading afterward while Sarah mended or worked on her latest sewing project. Their courtship progressed slowly, respectfully, but with an underlying certainty that neither questioned. The first time Dan kissed her properly was on Christmas Eve, after Matthew had finally gone to sleep, exhausted from the excitement of hanging stockings for the first time in his life. "I have something for you," Dan said, pulling a small package from his coat pocket. "I wanted to give it to you privately." Inside the carefully wrapped paper, Sarah found a silver brooch in the shape of a rose, delicate and beautifully crafted. "It was my mother's," Dan explained. "One of the few things I have from her." "Dan, I can't accept this," Sarah began, but he took her hands in his. "You can, if you'll accept something else along with it." His eyes held hers steadily. "Sarah Wilson, I've come to love you more than I thought possible. And Matthew too. I want you both to be my family properly. Will you marry me?" Sarah's breath caught. Despite the growing closeness between them, despite the looks and touches that had become more frequent, she hadn't expected this not so soon. "What about Matthew?" she asked, the question that always came first for her. "His condition won't improve. He'll always need extra care, extra patience." "I know that," Dan said simply, "and I love him just as he is. I'd be proud to call him my son." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as the walls she'd built around her heart over years of disappointment and rejection finally crumbled completely. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we'll marry you." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded, his arms pulling her close in the lamplight. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the same church hall where they'd danced. Matthew stood proudly beside them, holding the rings on a small pillow that only wobbled slightly in his excited hands. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Dan knelt down to Matthew's level. "You know what this means, partner?" he asked seriously. Matthew nodded. "You're my papa now." "That's right," Dan confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "And you're my son. Always will be." He gathered the boy into his arms, holding him close as Sarah watched through tears of joy, the three of them forming a family circle that had once seemed impossible. Spring came early that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the earth. Sarah stood on the porch of the main house, their house, now watching as Dan led Matthew around the corral on Shadow, the boy sitting tall in the saddle, his face a study in concentration. Her hand rested on her stomach, where the first signs of new life were just beginning to make themselves known. She hadn't told Dan yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news that their family would be growing again by winter. As if sensing her thoughts, Dan looked up and caught her eye across the yard. The smile he gave her was full of such love and contentment that Sarah felt it like warmth spreading through her body. Matthew called out, "Look, Mama, I'm riding." "I see you, sweetheart," she called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Matthew already asleep inside, Sarah finally shared her news. Dan's face transformed with wonder as he placed his hand over hers on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, pulling her close against his side. "When I heard you whisper, 'Please don't mock my son,' that day, something told me my life was about to change forever. I just didn't know how completely." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, thinking of the journey that had brought them here from a desperate widow with a special child to a beloved wife and mother with a family stronger than she'd ever dreamed possible. "I love you, Daniel Colton," she said softly. "And I love you, Sarah Colton," he replied, his lips finding hers as the last light of day faded from the sky, promising another tomorrow for the family they had built together.